The stillness of that Tunisian night held a quality that soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives, a quietness so profound that when the distant rumble began, it seemed to come from the earth itself rather than across it. American troops positioned along the ridge near El Geta had been waiting in darkness, their half-tracks concealed in whatever shadows the moonless desert could provide, and every man among them understood that what approached through the darkness was something they had trained for but never truly faced. The 10th Panzer Division was coming, and with it came the full weight of German armoured doctrine, perfected in the conquest of Poland and France, now bearing down on soldiers who had yet to prove themselves in sustained combat against such an enemy. Inside the cramped confines of an M3 gun motor carriage, essentially a French 75mm artillery piece mounted atop an M3 half-track, a gunner sat with his hands on the breech, feeling the cold metal despite the warmth of his palms. The vehicle itself represented everything both hopeful and desperate about American preparations for this war. A hybrid creation born from necessity, carrying a weapon designed decades earlier, now tasked with stopping the most modern instruments of mechanized warfare. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead, mixing with the dust that seemed to coat everything in North Africa, and though the night air carried a chill, fear and anticipation generated their own heat. He had been told repeatedly during training that these gun motor carriages were the answer, that mobility and firepower combined would provide the edge needed against enemy armour. Yet facing the reality of approaching panzers, watching their silhouettes emerge from darkness into the pale light of a rising moon, such assurances felt suddenly hollow. The German tanks moved with the precision that had become their hallmark, a coordinated advance that spoke of experience and confidence, their turrets sweeping the terrain ahead, main guns elevated slightly as they searched for targets. For the American defenders, watching this approach meant confronting doubts that training had never fully suppressed. The vehicles they crewed possessed almost no armour, their crews exposed to anything more substantial than rifle fire, and the guns they operated, while capable in theory, had never been tested against the specific threat now materialising before them. When the order to fire finally came, breaking the tension that had built to nearly unbearable levels, the night transformed into chaos measured in muzzle flashes and the shriek of high-velocity shells crossing open ground. The American guns opened up in sequence, each firing position revealing itself in flame and smoke, the 75mm rounds racing toward German armour with velocities that physics dictated but could not guarantee effectiveness. Some shells found their marks, penetrating side armour or striking vulnerable points, and panzers that moments before had seemed unstoppable suddenly became funeral pyres, flames erupting from hatches as crews attempted desperate escapes. Other rounds struck at angles that deflected them harmlessly skyward, sparks dancing across thick steel plates that shrugged off impacts that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. The German response came swiftly, their guns traversing toward the sources of fire, and when panzer cannons spoke, the results were devastating. American gun motor carriages, possessing virtually no protection, disintegrated under direct hits or erupted in flames when ammunition stowed too close to thin hull plates ignited. Men who had been crewing these vehicles moments before found themselves scrambling away from burning wrecks or lay silent among twisted metal. The engagement lasted hours, though for those involved it felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous, time distorting under stress until individual moments stretched while the broader action blurred. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, 38 German tanks lay destroyed or disabled across the valley floor, testament to the determination and accuracy of American gunners who had stood their ground despite inadequate equipment. Yet the cost had been severe. 21 of the improvised tank destroyers obliterated, their crews dead or wounded, the survivors haunted by memories of friends who had not escaped burning vehicles. This engagement at El Geta represented both proof of concept and warning, demonstrating that American forces could hurt German armour, but revealing the terrible price such victories demanded when fought with equipment designed more from desperation than comprehensive planning. Understanding why the United States had placed such faith in these fragile vehicles requires stepping back to examine the intellectual and strategic environment of the late 1930s and early 1940s, a period when American military planners watched European warfare evolve with growing alarm. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 had introduced the world to blitzkrieg, a methodology that combined armour, aircraft and mechanized infantry in ways that shattered traditional defensive thinking. Polish forces, though brave and reasonably equipped by previous standards, found themselves overwhelmed in weeks, their cavalry charges and prepared positions swept aside by columns of tanks that refused to engage in the grinding attritional warfare that had characterized the previous global conflict. What made blitzkrieg so terrifying was not merely the presence of tanks. Armies had employed armoured vehicles in World War I, but rather the concentration and speed with which German forces used them, identifying weak points, penetrating deeply, then exploiting breakthroughs before defenders could re-establish coherent lines. The conquest of France in 1940 reinforced these lessons with even greater emphasis, as armies that had spent 2 decades preparing to fight another version of the Western Front found themselves outmanoeuvred and outpaced. French and British forces possessed tanks that in many cases matched or exceeded German vehicles in armour and firepower. Yet they dispersed these assets across infantry divisions rather than concentrating them for maximum effect, and their command structures proved too rigid to respond to the fluid, fast-moving battles that erupted across Belgium and northern France. The Maginot Line, that extensive system of fortifications that represented years of effort and resources, was simply bypassed through terrain French planners had considered impassable for large armoured formations. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered and Britain had evacuated its expeditionary force from Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all heavy equipment. For American observers, particularly those charged with preparing the United States for potential involvement in this expanding conflict, these campaigns suggested that traditional methods of stopping tanks had become obsolete overnight. The conventional approaches to anti-tank warfare that armies had developed since the First World War all seemed inadequate against blitzkrieg. Heavy artillery, while capable of destroying any tank then in existence, required time to position and aim, making it useless against fast-moving targets. Towed anti-tank guns offered better mobility, but still needed to be unlimbered and emplaced, vulnerable during setup and unable to relocate quickly once engaged. Tank-on-tank combat demanded vehicles with thick armour and powerful guns, expensive assets that required extensive support infrastructure and could not be produced in sufficient numbers quickly. More troubling still was the realization that German doctrine emphasized concentrating armour on narrow fronts, achieving local superiority that could overwhelm any static defensive line regardless of how well prepared. The question facing American planners was fundamental and urgent. How could an army stop massed armour once it achieved breakthrough, before it could rampage through rear areas, destroying supply lines and command structures? From this strategic anxiety emerged what would become known as the tank destroyer doctrine, a uniquely American approach to countering armoured warfare. Rather than accepting passive defense or matching enemy tank for tank, American planners proposed creating specialized units whose sole purpose would be hunting and destroying enemy armor. These units would possess exceptional mobility, allowing them to concentrate rapidly wherever enemy breakthroughs occurred. They would employ aggressive tactics, seeking out enemy armor rather than waiting for it to appear. Most critically, they would be organized and trained separately from regular tank units, developing expertise specifically focused on anti-tank combat rather than the broader missions that tank divisions had to fulfill. In theory, when German panzers punched through American lines, tank destroyer battalions would converge on the penetration from multiple directions, ambushing enemy columns before they could exploit their breakthrough, destroying enough vehicles to stall the advance until conventional forces could restore the front. The concept received its first practical test during the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, Massive exercises that pitted American armored units against forces equipped with improvised tank destroyers. These war games, conducted across thousands of square miles of Louisiana terrain, represented the largest peacetime military exercises in American history, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and providing planners with opportunities to evaluate tactical concepts before risking them in actual combat. The tank destroyer units, despite their improvised equipment, performed remarkably well during these exercises, appearing suddenly to savage armoured columns before disappearing to strike elsewhere. Critics would later point out that the manoeuvres had been structured with rules that favoured tank destroyer tactics, allowing them advantages they might not possess in real combat, but the impression made on observers was powerful and immediate. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair emerged as the most influential champion of tank destroyer doctrine, seeing in it a solution to the problem that had tormented Allied planners since Poland fell. McNair believed passionately that specialized anti-tank units could provide the answer to blitzkrieg, that properly trained crews using mobile platforms could hunt German armor effectively while costing far less than producing equivalent numbers of heavy tanks. Under his guidance and with his considerable authority within Army ground forces, the tank destroyer concept rapidly expanded from theoretical discussion to organizational reality. The Army established a dedicated tank destroyer command, separate from armor or artillery branches, with its own training facilities, doctrine, and command structure. Fort Hood, Texas became the center for tank destroyer training, where crews drilled endlessly in the tactics that doctrine demanded, practicing rapid deployment, camouflage, aggressive maneuver, and quick disengagement after firing. The ambition driving this expansion was extraordinary. At its peak, planners envisioned more than 200 tank destroyer battalions, an enormous commitment of manpower and resources to a doctrine that remained unproven in actual combat. By late 1942, 53 battalions had already been activated, representing over 40,000 soldiers committed to this experimental branch of warfare. American newspapers published articles describing these new units with enthusiasm, presenting tank destroyers as the answer to German armoured superiority, weapons that would make Rommel and his colleagues reconsider their tactics. The public narrative suggested confidence, a nation that had fallen behind in armoured warfare development now claiming to have found the solution through innovative doctrine rather than merely matching enemy capabilities tank for tank. Yet even as the tank destroyer force expanded, questions persisted among those willing to voice them. The vehicles being designed and produced for these battalions all shared common characteristics that generated concern: relatively light armour to maximise speed, open-topped turrets to save weight and improve visibility, and guns oriented more toward armour penetration than high-explosive effectiveness. Could such vehicles truly survive against the newest German tanks, the Tigers and Panthers that intelligence reports suggested possessed both heavier armour and more powerful guns than anything previously encountered? Would a doctrine built around countering massed armoured breakthroughs remain relevant if German forces, weakened by years of war, could no longer mount such offensives? These questions received less attention than the enthusiastic promotion of the concept, but they would resurface once American forces engaged German armour in sustained combat. The first tank destroyers to see action bore almost no resemblance to the sleek, purpose-built vehicles that doctrine envisioned. They were improvisations, desperate attempts to give physical form to theoretical concepts using whatever components and weapons happened to be available. The M6 gun motor carriage represented perhaps the crudest of these early attempts, consisting of little more than a 37mm anti-tank gun mounted on the bed of a 3/4-ton Dodge truck. The gun itself was already recognized as inadequate against modern tank armor, and mounting it on an unarmored truck did nothing to address this fundamental weakness. Crews who trained with the M6 understood its limitations with dark humor, joking that the vehicle's primary value lay in frightening its operators rather than the enemy. Yet this ungainly contraption represented the best available option in the earliest days, when the need to field some kind of mobile anti-tank capability outweighed concerns about effectiveness. The M3 gun motor carriage marked a modest improvement, taking advantage of the M3 half-track's combination of wheels and tracks to provide better cross-country mobility than wheeled vehicles could offer. Mounted atop this chassis sat a French 75mm gun, a weapon that had been obsolescent even during the First World War, but which possessed reasonable armor-piercing capability when provided with modern ammunition. The combination was awkward. The gun sat high on the vehicle, making it difficult to conceal, and the mounting absorbed recoil poorly, but it could move at decent speeds and deliver meaningful firepower. For soldiers training with the M3 in the United States during 1941 and 1942, this vehicle represented progress, a platform that might actually accomplish the missions that doctrine described. Combat in North Africa during 1942 provided the first real test of these improvised designs, and the results proved both encouraging and sobering. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged Rommel's experienced panzer units at El Gheta, equipped with M3 gun motor carriages, employing the tactics they had drilled endlessly in training: rapid movement to firing positions, engagement at maximum effective range, immediate withdrawal to alternate positions before enemy could respond with counterfire. Against elements of the 10th Panzer Division, the 601st succeeded in destroying significant numbers of German tanks, proving that mobility and aggressive tactics could overcome deficiencies in armor protection. But the price was terrible. Nearly two-thirds of the battalion's vehicles were destroyed during the engagement, and casualty rates among crews were horrifying. The engagement demonstrated that doctrine could work, that determined men in vulnerable vehicles could hurt enemy armor, but it also revealed the cost such tactics demanded. The lessons from these early engagements accelerated development of purpose-built tank destroyers, rather than continuing to rely on improvised conversions. The M10 Wolverine emerged as the first vehicle designed from the start as a tank destroyer, using the hull and running gear of the M4 Sherman tank as its foundation, but mounting a new open-topped pentagonal turret that housed a 76mm M7 gun. This weapon offered significantly better armor penetration than the 75mm guns that equipped most Sherman tanks, giving the M10 the ability to engage German medium tanks at ranges where they could respond effectively. General Motors and Ford tooled up to produce the M10 in large numbers, and by 1943, thousands were rolling off assembly lines destined for battalions training in the United States and those already fighting overseas. For crews transitioning from M3s to M10s, the Wolverine represented a substantial upgrade. The vehicle possessed actual armor, not thick by tank standards, but enough to stop rifle fire and shell fragments that would have penetrated the M3's thin hull. The 76mm gun gave crews confidence that they could penetrate the armor of any German tank they were likely to encounter except the newest Tigers, and the use of Sherman components meant that the M10 benefited from an existing support and maintenance infrastructure. Yet the Wolverine also embodied the compromises inherent in tank destroyer doctrine. To save weight and maximize speed, armor thickness remained modest, particularly when compared to actual tanks. The turret rotated manually rather than via power traverse, meaning that tracking moving targets required exhausting physical labor from the gunner. Most significantly, the open top that characterized tank destroyer design left crews exposed to anything falling from above: shrapnel from airbursts, grenades, small arms fire from elevated positions. The M18 Hellcat represented the apex of one particular interpretation of tank destroyer philosophy, the belief that speed itself could serve as armor. Designed by Buick and entering service in 1944, the Hellcat could reach speeds approaching 50 miles per hour on roads, making it one of the fastest tracked vehicles of the war. Its agility was extraordinary, capable of rapid acceleration and surprisingly nimble handling for a vehicle mounting a turret. Crews loved driving Hellcats, finding them responsive and even enjoyable compared to the grinding, lurching progress of heavier vehicles. But this performance came at a steep price. The M18's armor was minimal, barely an inch thick in most places, providing protection only against the lightest weapons. Against a German 75mm or 88mm gun, a Hellcat might as well have been made from paper. The M18's design philosophy assumed that tank destroyers would never slug it out with enemy armour in sustained engagements, that speed and surprise would allow them to strike before enemies could respond effectively, then escape before return fire arrived. This assumption worked brilliantly when circumstances permitted, when terrain offered concealment for approaches and withdrawals, when intelligence about enemy movements allowed Hellcats to position themselves for ambushes. But warfare rarely provided such ideal conditions consistently, and there were numerous instances where M18 crews found themselves in situations where armour would have been more valuable than speed, where enemy fire arrived too quickly for evasion to matter, where thin steel proved inadequate against weapons designed to destroy much heavier vehicles. The M36 Jackson arrived later in the war, incorporating lessons from earlier designs while addressing their most significant weakness. Armed with a 90mm gun, the same weapon that would later arm the M26 Pershing heavy tank, the Jackson could penetrate the frontal armour of Panthers and Tigers at combat ranges, giving American crews their first weapon truly capable of meeting German heavy armour on equal terms. The 90mm gun transformed what tank destroyer crews could accomplish, allowing them to engage targets that had previously been nearly invulnerable to American fire, and the psychological impact of possessing such a weapon cannot be overstated. Crews who had grown accustomed to needing multiple hits to disable heavy German tanks suddenly found that single well-placed shots could achieve kills, and the ability to penetrate German armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres meant that Jacksons could engage before enemy guns reached effective range. These vehicles, the M10, M18 and M36, represented the evolution of American tank destroyer thinking from improvisation toward specialised design. Each embodied different aspects of the doctrine, the M10 balancing firepower and protection, the M18 emphasizing speed and agility above all else, the M36 prioritizing gunpower sufficient to handle any target. Together they equipped the dozens of tank destroyer battalions that deployed to Europe and the Pacific, and in the hands of determined crews they would write a combat record that was simultaneously impressive and controversial, demonstrating both the potential and limitations of the doctrine that created them. The men who crewed these vehicles came from every corner of American society: farm boys from the Midwest, mechanics from Detroit, college students whose education was interrupted by war, immigrants seeking to prove their loyalty to their adopted country. Tank destroyer training transformed them into specialists, teaching skills that went beyond basic gunnery and driving. They learned to read terrain with an eye toward identifying ideal firing positions, locations offering concealment and good fields of fire while permitting rapid withdrawal. They practiced camouflage techniques endlessly, learning to break up the distinctive silhouette of their vehicles using whatever materials the local environment provided. Gunnery training emphasized first-round hits, understanding that tank destroyer doctrine allowed little room for adjusting fire. Crews were expected to fire, score a hit, and displace before enemy gunners could respond. Life in tank destroyer battalions during the long months of training and the longer months of deployment mixed tedium with sudden terror, routine punctuated by moments of desperate violence. When not in combat, crews maintained their vehicles obsessively, understanding that mechanical reliability could mean the difference between successfully escaping an engagement and being caught in the open by enemy fire. They wrote letters home, trying to explain experiences to families who could never truly understand what combat meant, what it felt like to see friends die in burning vehicles, what it did to a person to know that survival often depended more on luck than skill. They told stories, exaggerating exploits and downplaying fears, creating the folklore that allowed them to process trauma and maintain morale. The voyage to Europe represented a transition point for most tank destroyer battalions, the end of training and the beginning of war. Men who had spent months or years drilling at Fort Hood suddenly found themselves loading vehicles onto transports, sailing across the Atlantic wondering whether German submarines would find them, then unloading in Britain or North Africa to face the reality they had trained to confront. The English Channel crossing for those participating in D-Day and subsequent operations carried particular dread, as men understood that beaches and hedgerows of Normandy would offer no mercy to mistakes or hesitation. Landing craft pitched and rolled in heavy seas, diesel fumes mixing with the smell of fear and vomit, and when ramps finally dropped, the organised chaos of amphibious assault replaced the nervous waiting with sensory overload. The hedgerows of Normandy presented challenges that no amount of training in Texas or Louisiana could have fully prepared tank destroyer crews to face. These ancient agricultural boundaries, earth banks topped with thick vegetation, divided the Norman countryside into countless small fields, each separated from its neighbours by walls of earth and bramble that channeled movement and restricted visibility to distances measured in yards rather than hundreds of metres. For tank destroyer doctrine built around long-range engagement and rapid manoeuvre, the hedgerows were nightmarish terrain, eliminating the standoff distances that allowed thinly armoured vehicles to engage safely, turning every advance into a close-range encounter where whoever spotted the enemy first usually survived while the slower party died. The engagement near St. Lo on July 11, 1944, demonstrated both how tank destroyers could succeed in such conditions and how costly success could be. When the Panzer Lehr Division launched its counterattack attempting to relieve pressure on German forces struggling to contain the American breakout, M10 Wolverines from the 799th and 823rd tank destroyer battalions were positioned in and around the village of Le Désert. The German attack came at dawn, Panthers emerging from the morning mist in the methodical advance that characterized German armor tactics, tank commanders scanning for threats while infantry followed closely to suppress anti-tank weapons. The American tank destroyers had positioned themselves during darkness, using the village buildings and hedgerows to create overlapping fields of fire, and when Panthers entered the killing zone, multiple M10s engaged simultaneously. The violence of that engagement compressed hours of training into minutes of execution. Gunners identified targets through their optics, called ranges to their crews, felt the jar as loaders slammed shells into breaches, then fired, the 76mm guns recoiling violently inside their turrets. Armour-piercing rounds covered the distance to German tanks in fractions of a second, striking with impact velocities that determined whether penetration occurred. Some shots hit at angles that allowed them to pierce through, and Panthers that moments before had been manoeuvring confidently suddenly stopped, smoke pouring from hatches as internal ammunition ignited. Other rounds struck at angles that deflected them skyward, the distinctive spark pattern indicating failed penetration, and German tank commanders who saw these failures immediately traversed their turrets toward the source, their own guns preparing to respond. German return fire proved devastating when it found targets, the Panther's 75mm gun-firing armour-piercing rounds that could penetrate M10 armour at any combat range. Hits on American tank destroyers often resulted in catastrophic kills, ammunition stowage igniting, or crew compartments being penetrated with results that left few survivors. The open tops that gave tank destroyer crews excellent visibility also meant that shell fragments and shrapnel from near misses could wound or kill, and several M10s were disabled not by direct hits, but by fragments that wounded enough crewmen to leave vehicles unable to fight. The battle raged through morning and into afternoon, with Allied fighter bombers eventually joining the engagement, their rockets and bombs adding to the carnage already littering the fields. When the smoke finally cleared and German forces withdrew, American crews conducted the grim accounting that followed every engagement. 30 German tanks lay destroyed or abandoned, testament to the effectiveness of prepared positions and aggressive fire. But the cost had been high. Several American tank destroyers were total losses, their crews killed or so severely wounded that they would never return to duty. The survivors, blackened with smoke and exhausted from hours of sustained action, understood that they had proven something important, that tank destroyers could stand against German armour and prevail, that the doctrine had value despite its flaws. Yet they also understood the price such victories demanded, measured in friends who would not answer roll call that evening. Mortain in August 1944 represented Germany's last serious armoured offensive in France, a desperate attempt to cut off Allied forces that had broken through German lines and threatened to encircle entire armies. Hitler himself ordered the attack, committing 4 panzer divisions to a thrust aimed at Avranches, where American forces had concentrated supplies and reinforcements pouring through the narrow corridor that Operation Cobra had opened. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself directly in the path of this offensive, their towed 76mm guns emplaced in fields and behind hedgerows around the town, crews manning positions they had prepared during the preceding days without knowing how soon those preparations would be tested. The German attack began before dawn on August 7th, panthers and tigers advancing through fog so thick that visibility measured barely beyond arm's length. American defenders heard the enemy before seeing them, the distinctive sound of German tank engines and the grinding of tracks on roads, but fog made target acquisition nearly impossible. Tank destroyer crews fired at muzzle flashes and sound, pulling lanyards without clear sight of their targets, hoping that volume of fire might compensate for inability to aim precisely. The engagement was chaotic and close, with German armour sometimes approaching to within a few hundred metres before American gunners achieved clear sight pictures. Towed guns, unable to displace under fire, stood their ground by necessity rather than choice, and crews who might have preferred to execute the shoot-and-scoot tactics they had trained for instead found themselves slugging it out in sustained exchanges with vastly superior numbers of enemy tanks. 14 German tanks were destroyed by the 823rd's towed guns before German fire suppressed or destroyed many of the American positions. 11 guns were lost, their crews dead beside the weapons they had served to the end, and for a time it appeared that German armour might achieve breakthrough despite initial resistance. But self-propelled tank destroyers, M10s and M8s, rushed forward to reinforce the crumbling line, their mobility allowing them to plug gaps that towed guns could not cover. These reinforcements engaged at closer ranges than doctrine suggested, sometimes firing from positions that offered minimal concealment because the tactical situation allowed no better options. The battle for Mortain continued for days, with German forces making repeated attempts to break through American lines. But the combination of determined infantry, arriving reinforcements, and effective use of available tank destroyers prevented the breakthrough that Hitler had demanded. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December 1944 and remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, represented tank destroyers' greatest trial and their finest hour. Hitler gambled everything remaining to Germany on one final offensive, concentrating panzer divisions that should have been defending German territory for an attack through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting Allied armies and capturing the supply port at Antwerp. The offensive achieved complete surprise. American forces in the Ardennes had considered the sector quiet and were caught unprepared when German armour smashed through thinly held lines. The weather prevented Allied air power from intervening initially, low clouds and snow grounding the aircraft that had dominated European skies for months, giving German forces freedom of movement they had not possessed since 1940. Tank destroyer battalions found themselves rushed to crisis points throughout the Ardennes, ordered to hold positions that doctrine said they should never occupy, expected to function as mobile reserves and last-ditch defensive lines simultaneously. At Neuville, near the town of Bastogne that would become famous for its encirclement, a platoon of M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion charged directly into advancing German columns in actions that resembled cavalry charges more than carefully planned ambushes. The crews understood the risks, knew that Hellcat armour could not stop German guns, but the tactical situation left no room for doctrinal purity. They raced forward at speeds that left supporting infantry far behind, relying on surprise and aggression rather than careful preparation, and engaged German tanks at ranges where both sides could achieve kills with single shots. The M18's speed, normally used for rapid displacement after firing, instead allowed these Hellcats to dash between cover points, appearing from unexpected directions to engage German columns before disappearing around buildings or into terrain folds. In a single day of fighting around Nouville, crews from the 705th claimed 30 enemy tank kills, a figure that seemed impossible given the forces involved, but which subsequent research into German records largely confirmed. Several Hellcats were lost to return fire or to German infantry armed with Panzerfausts who managed to approach close enough to engage, but the majority survived by constant movement, never remaining in one location long enough for German gunners to range in effectively. The cost in crew fatigue was enormous. Drivers pushed machines to their limits while gunners and commanders scanned constantly for threats, knowing that a moment's inattention could prove fatal. Further north at St. Vith, the 84th Tank Destroyer Battalion fought a different kind of battle, one that more closely resembled the long-range engagements that doctrine envisioned. Armed with M36 Jacksons mounting 90mm guns, the 84th engaged German armour including Panthers and Tigers at ranges exceeding 2 kilometres, duelling in conditions where snow limited visibility but also highlighted targets against white backgrounds. The Jackson's powerful gun allowed American crews to penetrate German armour at distances where return fire was less accurate, and gunners who had trained extensively in long-range accuracy found that their skills made the difference between survival and destruction. Over 2 days of desperate fighting, the 84th destroyed dozens of German tanks but lost half their own strength. Some vehicles knocked out by enemy fire, others abandoned when mechanical failures occurred at the worst possible moments. Even older M10 Wolverines found themselves in crucial roles during the Ardennes fighting. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion held positions that anchored the northern shoulder of the German penetration, preventing enemy forces from widening the breakthrough that might have allowed them to reach the Meuse River and beyond. For 2 days, M10 crews fired on advancing German armour, their 76mm guns effective against the side and rear armour of even heavy tanks when proper positions allowed flanking shots. 17 German tanks were destroyed before the enemy pulled back, recognizing that the ridge could not be taken without casualties that the German army could no longer afford. The M10S that held Elsenborn Ridge were obsolescent by 1944 standards, their guns smaller than those of newer tank destroyers, their armour thin even by the modest standards of the breed, yet in the hands of experienced crews fighting from prepared positions, they proved sufficient to accomplish the mission. The statistics from the Ardennes offensive told a story that would fuel debates about tank destroyer effectiveness for decades afterward. American tank destroyer battalions lost 119 vehicles during the battle, a horrifying number that represented significant portions of the battalions engaged. Of those losses, 86 were towed guns, weapons that had proved almost impossible to use effectively in the mobile warfare that characterized the Bulge, and which were increasingly recognized as relics of earlier thinking about anti-tank defense. But against those losses, tank destroyer battalions claimed more than 300 German tank kills, a ratio that compared favorably to almost any other American unit engaged in the battle. For every tank destroyer lost, German forces lost roughly 2.5 tanks, and while kill claims are always subject to inflation and confusion in the chaos of combat, enough correlation with German records exists to suggest these figures were broadly accurate. The debate over what these statistics meant began immediately and has never entirely ended. Critics pointed out that tank destroyers had not operated in the way doctrine intended, that the Ardennes fighting involved more desperate last stands than carefully planned ambushes, that many tank destroyer units had been used as glorified towed artillery or emergency reserves rather than as the mobile hunters that doctrine described. They argued that the high loss rate, particularly among towed guns, demonstrated the fundamental flaw in creating specialized anti-tank units rather than simply producing more Sherman tanks with better guns. Defenders of tank-destroyer doctrine countered that the high kill ratios proved the concept that crews trained specifically for anti-tank combat had outperformed regular tank units even when fighting under conditions that doctrine had not anticipated. They pointed out that flexibility and adaptation were virtues, not failures, that the ability of tank-destroyer battalions to shift between direct fire support, long-range anti-armor work, and emergency defensive missions demonstrated value beyond the narrow role originally envisioned. The truth existed somewhere between these positions, complicated by the reality that warfare rarely conforms to the theories developed during peacetime. Tank destroyers had not fought the war that planners in 1941 had imagined. Massed German armoured breakthroughs requiring concentrated mobile anti-tank reserves never materialised in the way that Poland and France suggested they might. Instead, tank destroyer battalions found themselves dispersed in penny packets, attached to infantry divisions that needed fire support more than they needed specialised tank hunters, employed in ways that made their distinguishing characteristics: open tops, thin armour, emphasis on mobility, more liability than advantage. Yet within those constraints, tank-destroyer crews had adapted, learned, and ultimately contributed significantly to victory, even if not in the manner originally intended. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, and Allied armies drove deeper into Germany itself, tank-destroyer battalions continued fighting even as questions about their future multiplied. The vehicles and weapons continued to prove effective. M36 Jacksons particularly earned respect for their ability to destroy any German tank in existence, and crews had developed tactics that maximized their equipment's strengths while minimizing weaknesses. But parallel developments were rendering tank destroyer specialization increasingly redundant. Newer Sherman tanks, particularly the M4A3E8 model, armed with 76mm guns and improved armour, possessed capabilities very similar to M10 Wolverines while offering better protection and greater tactical flexibility. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, just beginning to reach Europe in early 1945, mounted the same 90mm gun as the M36 Jackson, but carried it in a fully enclosed turret with armour sufficient to withstand most German weapons. The doctrine that had seemed so revolutionary in 1941 was quietly being abandoned, even as units created by that doctrine continued fighting. In January 1945, the Army ordered many towed tank destroyer battalions converted to self-propelled equipment, an admission that the original vision of both self-propelled and towed units had failed, that modern warfare demanded mobility that towed guns simply could not provide. The Tank Destroyer Command began to see its autonomy eroded, with greater integration into conventional command structures rather than the separate chain of command that had been established. Officers who had championed the doctrine found themselves reassigned or retired, and the institutional momentum that had created dozens of battalions rapidly dissipated. Tank destroyer crews themselves remained largely unaware of these high-level debates, focused as they were on the immediate tasks of combat. They fought through the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive belt, their guns proving as effective against concrete bunkers as they had been against tank armour. They provided covering fire for the capture of the Remagen Bridge across the Rhine, that miraculous prize that gave Allied forces their first foothold on the east bank of Germany's greatest river. They participated in the final drives into Germany's heartland, encountering less enemy armour as German forces collapsed, but finding their guns useful for reducing strongpoints and supporting infantry in street fighting. They fought until Germany surrendered, until the last guns fell silent and the long journey home could begin. But even as veterans celebrated survival and mourned lost comrades, the institutional decision had already been made. 3 months after VE Day, with the war in the Pacific still raging but clearly approaching its conclusion, the United States Army disbanded the Tank Destroyer Command. The separate branch that had been created with such enthusiasm just 4 years earlier ceased to exist, its personnel and equipment absorbed back into conventional units, its specialized training centers closed or repurposed. The decision came with little fanfare or explanation, simply an administrative action that reflected conclusions reached by planners who had weighed the doctrine against combat results and found it wanting. Fort Hood, that massive training facility that had processed tens of thousands of tank destroyer crewmen, transitioned to other missions, eventually becoming one of the Army's premier armoured warfare centres, but no longer teaching the specialised doctrine that had been developed there. The tank destroyers themselves, thousands of vehicles representing multiple designs and years of production, faced various fates. Some were retained in American service, particularly M36 Jacksons whose powerful guns remained relevant, but most were either scrapped, sold as surplus, or provided to Allied nations rebuilding their militaries. Within a few years, American tank destroyer battalions existed only in records and memories, their contribution to victory acknowledged but their specialized role abolished. The Korean War provided an unexpected coda to the tank destroyer story when conflict erupted on that peninsula in June 1950. North Korean forces invaded the south with Soviet-supplied T-34/85 tanks that initially overwhelmed South Korean and early arriving American forces equipped primarily with light weapons. In the desperate fighting of summer 1950, the United States rushed whatever armoured vehicles could be spared from occupation duties in Japan, including 36 Jacksons that had been sitting in depots since 1945. These tank destroyers, crewed by hastily trained soldiers, many of whom had no combat experience, found themselves facing T-34s in engagements that resembled the close-range battles of European hedgerows more than the sweeping manoeuvres that Korean terrain might have suggested. The M36's 90mm gun proved devastatingly effective against T-34 armour, capable of penetrating at any combat range and angle. Tank destroyer crews who had trained briefly on tactics developed for fighting Germans found those same principles worked equally well against North Korean armour, and the psychological impact on enemy forces of having their supposedly invulnerable tanks destroyed by long-range accurate fire cannot be overstated. Yet this success came too late to revive tank destroyer doctrine. By 1950, the M26 Pershing and its successor, the M46 Patton, were establishing themselves as America's standard medium tanks, both mounting 90mm guns in fully enclosed turrets with armour superior to any tank destroyer. The M36's success in Korea demonstrated that the vehicle itself remained potent, but the specialised doctrine that created it had been definitively superseded by the concept of the main battle tank. Beyond American service, tank destroyers found new lives in the armies of nations that received them as military aid or purchased them as surplus. Yugoslavia operated M18 Hellcats into the 1990s, finding their speed and relatively compact size useful for the mountainous terrain of the Balkans. Various NATO allies used M10s and M36s through the 1950s, appreciating their powerful guns even as the vehicles themselves aged. Some nations modified their tank destroyers extensively, mounting new engines or upgrading armour, extending service lives well beyond what American planners had envisioned. The fact that these vehicles remained useful for decades after their original doctrine had been abandoned says something about the quality of their design, even if it also highlights how doctrine and hardware do not always align perfectly. The intellectual legacy of tank destroyer doctrine proved more enduring and more significant than the hardware it produced. The American experience with specialized anti-tank units influenced post-war thinking about armored warfare in subtle but important ways. The failed experiment demonstrated the dangers of over-specialization, of creating forces optimized for one mission so specifically that they struggle when operational reality differs from planning assumptions. This lesson contributed to the development of the main battle tank concept, the idea that rather than separate vehicles for different roles, a single versatile platform could fulfill multiple missions, providing the flexibility that modern warfare demanded. The M48 Patton and its successors embodied this thinking. Tanks that could engage enemy armour, support infantry, and conduct independent operations without requiring separate specialised vehicles for anti-tank work. Tank destroyer doctrine also influenced how armies thought about defensive operations and mobile reserves. The idea that mobile forces could concentrate rapidly to counter enemy breakthroughs remained valid even if the specific implementation through specialized tank destroyer battalions did not. Post-war NATO defensive planning incorporated many concepts that tank destroyer advocates had championed: emphasis on prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire, multiple defensive lines to absorb and channel enemy attacks, mobile reserves positioned to counterattack penetrations. These ideas persisted even though the forces implementing them consisted of regular tank and mechanized infantry units rather than specialized tank destroyers. The doctrine evolved while the specialized branch disappeared. Perhaps most importantly, the tank destroyer experience taught American military planners the importance of adaptability and the danger of doctrinal rigidity. The battalions that succeeded in Europe did so not by strictly following the doctrine they had been taught, but by adapting to circumstances, accepting missions that doctrine said they should not perform, developing tactics that training had not emphasized. The crews who survived were those who could improvise, who understood that principles mattered more than rules, who were willing to use their equipment in ways designers had not necessarily intended. This lesson about flexibility and adaptation would prove valuable in subsequent conflicts where American forces again found that operational reality diverged significantly from planning assumptions. The historical debate about tank destroyer effectiveness continues even decades after the last battalion was disbanded, with historians and military analysts drawing different conclusions from the same evidence. Critics emphasize the high loss rates, the open tops that left crews vulnerable, the relatively thin armor that required careful tactics to compensate for, and the fact that specialized tank destroyer units were disbanded so quickly after the war. They argue that resources devoted to tank destroyers would have been better spent producing more Sherman tanks or developing better tank designs sooner, that the doctrine was flawed from inception, and only the courage and determination of individual crews prevented it from being recognized as a complete failure. Defenders of tank destroyer doctrine point to the kill ratios achieved, noting that tank destroyer battalions destroyed enemy armor more efficiently than regular tank units despite lighter armor and less protective vehicles. They highlight specific engagements where tank destroyers played crucial roles, battles like Mortain and actions during the Bulge, where their presence made the difference between successful defense and breakthrough. They argue that the rapid disbandment reflected peacetime cost-cutting and bureaucratic politics more than reasoned evaluation of combat effectiveness. That in a future war against massed Soviet armor, the mobile anti-tank doctrine would prove prescient even if the specific implementation through 1940s technology was flawed. The truth almost certainly exists between these positions, acknowledging both the genuine achievements and the real limitations. Tank destroyers succeeded in destroying large numbers of enemy tanks. Their crews demonstrated courage and skill in the face of terrifying odds, and specific battles might have been lost without their presence. Yet the doctrine that created them proved less revolutionary than promised. The massed breakthroughs it was designed to counter never materialized in the way planners feared, and the vehicles themselves carried compromises that cost lives even as they enabled success. The tank destroyer represented a moment in military development, a path taken that ultimately led to a dead end, but which provided valuable lessons for the path that eventually proved more successful. For the men who crewed these vehicles, the strategic and doctrinal debates mattered less than the immediate reality of combat and the bonds forged with those who fought beside them. They had been asked to take inadequate vehicles into battle against formidable opponents, to make up for deficiencies in armor with superiority in tactics, to succeed through determination where equipment fell short. Tens of thousands served in tank destroyer battalions, thousands died or were wounded, and those who survived carried memories of friends lost, vehicles burning, and the peculiar terror of sitting in an open-topped turret while shells fell all around. They had proven that courage could overcome inadequate equipment, that training and tactics mattered more than steel thickness, that Americans could master the science of destroying tanks as effectively as any army in the world. The disappearance of tank destroyer battalions from the American military structure within months of victory carried a certain poetic irony. These units had been created in response to a perceived crisis, a revolutionary new form of warfare that seemed to threaten everything traditional military thinking held certain. They represented an American attempt to counter German innovation through doctrine rather than simply matching capability for capability, to find a cleverer answer rather than a more expensive one. Yet by the time they proved their worth in combat, the crisis that created them had passed. German armour no longer posed the threat it once had, and the future of warfare was already moving in directions that made specialised anti-tank units obsolete. The tank destroyer existed in a narrow window between the blitzkrieg that inspired its creation and the main battle tank that rendered it unnecessary, achieving remarkable success within that window while the window itself was closing. The physical remnants of the tank destroyer era are scattered across museums and preserved battlefields, M10s and M8s and M36s sitting silent behind rope barriers, their open turrets now serving as distinctive identifiers rather than tactical liabilities. Veterans who crewed these vehicles have mostly passed now, taking with them the visceral understanding of what it meant to hunt German panzers in machines that offered so little protection. But the broader legacy persists in the way modern armies think about armoured warfare, in the emphasis on flexibility over specialisation, in the recognition that doctrine must serve operational needs rather than operational needs conforming to doctrine, in the understanding that victory comes from soldiers adapting to circumstances rather than circumstances conforming to plans. The story of American tank destroyers ultimately stands as a testament to both human ingenuity and human limitations, to the creative attempts to solve military problems through novel approaches, and to the reality that warfare rarely cooperates with even the most carefully developed theories. These vehicles and the men who crewed them accomplished remarkable things, destroying thousands of enemy tanks, contributing to victory in crucial battles, demonstrating that determination and skill could overcome material deficiencies. Yet they also demonstrated that specialized solutions carry inherent risks, that the weapon optimized for one specific threat may struggle when that threat fails to materialize in expected forms, that flexibility and adaptation matter more than perfect preparation for anticipated scenarios. The tank destroyer was both success and failure, both vindication of American tactical innovation and warning about the limits of specialized doctrine, both memorial to the men who fought in thin-skinned vehicles and lesson for planners developing the forces of tomorrow.